What I'm going to do today is talk to two research papers that the Productivity Commission did a couple of years ago on issues relating to inequality, and particularly about how it's been changing. But when I do, as I do, I think it's very important that we keep in mind two questions that are very relevant for policymakers, both inside and outside of government, when we consider inequality. The first question is, why should we be concerned about it? What about inequality should we worry about and respond to? And the second question is, what can and should we do about it? However, to address these questions, policymakers have to look behind aggregate statistics and broad statements such as poverty and inequality are increasing to examine what is happening in more detail. And this is a useful contribution made by the two staff research papers by the Productivity Commission. The first, Trends in the Distribution of Income in Australia, unpacks the various components of income to provide a clearer picture of what is contributing to changes in income inequality. The second, Deep and Persistent Disadvantage in Australia, examines different understandings of disadvantage and its impacts and what we know about causation. As I said, most of my talk is going to address those findings. However, I just want to pause for a moment to think about this issue about why policymakers should be concerned about inequality. And in thinking about inequality, I've often been struck by a statement by a writer, Walzer, about inequality. We should be concerned about inequality in one area when it relates to our lives in another sphere of our life. It's when inequality has various impacts that we should be particularly concerned. For myself, I've often said that there are at least three aspects of inequality that we might want to think about being concerned about. The first is when inequality is associated with serious hardship and suffering. And of course, that implies that we need to think about what's happening at the bottom end of the income distribution and understand serious disadvantage. The second, as was well illustrated by the OECD talk this morning, is when inequality is accompanied by very unequal opportunities to develop people's potential and to contribute to the society. And the third, the one we don't talk so much about, is when inequality might threaten social cohesion and our capacity to be an effective democracy. When we're thinking about income inequality, we do need to think about what kind of income we are talking about. And we can talk about, first of all, when we can sort of layer up the income by thinking about first income from work, labour income. For most Australians, it's the most important source of income and the main influence on living standards. Then, if we add to that income from investments and other sources, we can have market income, and then next we can add government payments, pensions, allowances and other supplements, and to get gross income. Then if we take away the taxes we pay, we have disposable income, and further, if we add the value of government services, health, education, we get final income. These various measures are usually aggregated at the household level to form household income, and then if we take into account household size, we have household equivalent, final household equivalised income, which gives us the best indication, it's not complete, of some idea of living standards that households might be able to enjoy. So the first Productivity Commission paper, Trends in the Distribution of Income, looked at those various measures of income and examined the interplay of them, underlying recent trends in inequality over the past 20 years from the late 1980s. And over those 20 years, the incomes of individuals and households rose substantially in real terms, as Ross Garno told us this morning. Individual labour earnings increased by around 38%, the blue line on the graph, and the red line shows that equivalised final household incomes increased by 64%. About 75% of the growth in real household earnings came from their increased labour force earnings, and this reflected increased employment, longer working hours by part-time workers, and increased real wages, again, as Rasgono told us. That is, over the 20-year period, more Australians got jobs, they worked longer hours, and were paid more. However, these increases were uneven. For individual earnings, the key drivers of increased inequality were a widening dispersion of hourly wages of full-time employers and relatively strong growth in part-time employment. In contrast, for households, the key driver of income inequality was capital income growth amongst higher income households. Note also, however, for households, the growing dispersion of hourly wages was offset by increased employment by household members. There were more second income earners among lower income levels, particularly in the 2000s, showing the importance of employment growth in containing inequality. The authors also found that government taxes and transfers had a substantial redistributive impact on the distribution of household income, substantially reducing measured inequality, as this slide shows, with the Gini declining, indicating less inequality, as we move from labour and market earnings to the measure of final income at the bottom. However, coupled with the rise in market income inequality, particularly capital income, over this period, final income inequality also rose. I now want to turn to look at really what was happening in more detail at the bottom and to disadvantage. Because as I mentioned, there is a particular interest in what happens to the living standards of those who struggle and are disadvantaged. And this was the focus of the second Productivity Commission paper. But there is no one agreed way to define and measure disadvantage. And the three measures, or the three ways of understanding it and measuring it that have been most commonly used in Australia is poverty, deprivation, and social exclusion. Poverty is usually measured by household income in relation to a line, usually 50% of the median. Deprivation in relation to the number of essentials that people do not have because they cannot afford them. And social exclusion often includes a number of dimensions which influences a person's capacity to be part of society. For example, employment, education, health status, and so on. The approaches complement each other to reflect the multi-dimensional nature of disadvantage and the experiences of people. As we can see from this slide, different estimates of overall disadvantage in 2010, there are different estimates of overall disadvantage in 2010 depending on the lenses and measured used, ranging from between 10 to 13% of Australians experiencing income poverty to 1/4 experiencing some form of social exclusion. However, we are particularly concerned when the experience of disadvantage is severe and prolonged, as the immediate and longer-term impacts are likely to be greater. And research showed that fewer Australians, as this slide shows, fewer Australians experience deep disadvantage. And that was the broader research showed that occurs whether we measure it by, say, income poverty when it's combined with few assets and low consumption, or whether it's measured by the number of deprivations that people experience. This slide shows that if you're thinking about social exclusion, whereas around 25% had some form of social exclusion, around 5% experienced deep social exclusion in 2010, down from 7% in 2001, the rate of very, very deep social exclusion was 1% in 2010 and was relatively stable over the decade. Other research from the Melbourne Institute that complements that shows that the experience of prolonged social exclusion is also less, and that between 2001 and 2010, just under 3% of adult Australians experienced deep social exclusion for 5 or more years, and less than 1% experienced deep social exclusion for 7 or more. What is important here to note is that the continued strength of the economy and the labour market contributed to the reduction and the prevalence of social exclusion and deep social exclusion over the decade to 2010, people finding jobs with associated increased incomes. But the stubborn presence of a group experiencing very, very deep social exclusion suggests that other interventions and assistance will be necessary to improve the situation of those with more complex needs. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this table, but the paper also examined who was more likely to be disadvantaged according to the different measures. The overall conclusion that was reached was that the characteristics, the people who are greatest risk of being very deeply disadvantaged for long periods of time, as you would probably wouldn't be surprised to know, was lone parents and their children, Indigenous Australians, people with a long-term health condition, disability, and people with low education attainment. But the important thing also to understand is that most people in these groups, through either their personal resilience and capabilities, their family support, or opportunities for work, or things that their communities were doing for them, did not experience that. And we do not know the difference between those that did and those that didn't in these categories. An important lack of knowledge that I'll talk about. When we were trying to think about causation of the experience of disadvantage, causation of the experience of deep and persistent disadvantage, we developed a framework that suggested that what is happening is some sort of complex interplay of factors. But the key, the probability that a person will experience disadvantage is likely to be influenced by their personal capabilities and family circumstances, the support they receive, the community where they live, life events, and the broader economic and social environment. And the paper goes into some detail about that. I don't have time to do that. The problem is that our limited knowledge of the complex interplay of these factors means that we cannot be clear about causation, particularly the disadvantage that is very deep and persistent, and that is a lack. However, when we looked at the research and literature, there were some things that we could be very clear about, and these have been mentioned today also to some extent. First of all, the importance of a child's early years, which fundamentally shape their life chances. Second, education as a foundation capability. And third, employment as a route out of disadvantage for most. That said, we did find that some job-poor households did experience even persistent disadvantage. One of the challenges for people in public administration is that we can't be. One of the reasons we can't be clear about causation is that knowledge about disadvantage is too thin in a number of areas. Longitudinal data is critical to understanding the dynamics of disadvantage, and we are very grateful for the development of data such as HILDA ANZSOG and so on. But they've only been going for a short time. Low and key people tend to drop out, and the numbers are still too low for us to really be able to find out what's happening in the fine detail that we need. The sample sizes are usually too small. We did conclude that administrative data is a significant potential source. Linking of administrative data sources also offers the potential to track people over longer periods of time and find out what is happening to them as a result of certain events or interventions. The integration of administrative data with other data sources has the potential, therefore, to provide new insights to inform researchers and policymakers about deep and persistent disadvantage. So, to conclude, before I make some concluding remarks about the relationship between economic growth and reducing different forms of inequality, can I say that the data that I have given you today went to 2010, but as Ross Garnaut told us, the situation has deteriorated since then. In particular, we've seen increased unemployment and lower income growth. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not quite as rosy. If it was rosy, according to the data that I presented to you before. But reflecting more generally about the relationship between economic growth and reducing different forms of inequality. The first thing I would say is that over what we've heard today, and our research confirms this, so over the 2000s, we combined with what happened particularly in the middle to later part of the 90s, we did have sustained economic growth, which allowed a lot more households that were either jobless or had little work to get more work. And we also saw increased income growth at the lower income end that was quite significant. So in terms of some forms of inequality, economic growth did help, and economic growth is fundamental. No doubt about that. But there are sort of three issues that I want to talk about there. There are four, actually, questions and comments I've got about that relationship. The study on disadvantage is clear that not all benefited from that growth. In particular, the persistence of a minimum of 1% of people that were very deeply disadvantaged for a long period of time, and the fact that that figure didn't change over the 2000s, and the fact that we know that there are many children probably in that group, does present a policy challenge to people inside and outside of government in terms of what is happening to the effectiveness of the services and interventions that are directed at this group. Why are they not working as well as they should, and what can we do about that? The second is that some of the inequality growth that we saw over the past 20 years, and this has been written about elsewhere, has been a growth at the top that's been higher than everyone else. And that growth at the top included a combination of higher hourly wages and improved market incomes. The question is, does that matter? Do we care? Should we at least think about whether it matters? Does it mean that those people who have been enjoying that group, do they understand what's happening? Are they becoming excluded? Or is it not the issue that we need to worry about? Does it relate to social cohesion? We at least need to ask the question. The third thing is, even when we saw strong growth at very low incomes over the 2000s, we still saw a growth in relative poverty. And that was because there was in Australia, again as Ross Garnaut told us, very, very strong growth of median incomes, higher than other countries. Now, does that matter? Does a growth in relative poverty, even when there is a substantial improvement in living standards, does that matter? So what should be our concern? I think there might be a concern there, but I do know from the many years that I've been working in this area that that is not generally shared in the community. So we need to discuss why that might be a problem and why it might not be more clearly. And it's about how we relate to each other, I think, but we do need to understand it better. And finally, given the importance of government action in moderating the increase in inequality through taxes, transfers and services, how can we maintain that protective effect that has been so strong in Australia? We've been able to do it at relatively low cost, as Peter Whiteford has showed us, because of the targeted nature of particularly of our income support system. How can that be maintained, that protective impact? How can that be maintained as we move to improve the budget position over time? Again, I think a question that we need to ask as we consider the relationship between growth and inequality. Thanks very much.